I'm with somebody that I'm very excited to have a conversation with because I love the Nature Conservancy. And for me, for the first time, to get to meet Jennifer Morris today, who calls herself an impatient optimist about the environment. And I want to find out her backstory. And really, so for me, it's a journey in front of you of exploration. When did you take over the Nature Conservancy?
It'll be 3 years this May.
Okay. Now, before we get into the big issues, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up, and what was your journey to now be ahead of something as important and global as the Nature Conservancy?
Great. Thanks so much, Douglas. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. So my journey started, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. My parents are actually here.
Where are your parents
Right
at?
there. Wave your hands.
Hey,
Hi,
guys.
Mom and Dad. And I don't know if you guys have done speaking engagements before, but I told them last night that there is nothing scarier than having your parents in the audience.
Well, there's one thing that adds to the scariness. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, too. I was,
You are?
Yeah, I was born in Crawford Long Hospital
Oh,
in Atlanta.
wow. Oh, amazing.
And get back there quite a bit.
Fantastic.
And
So I grew
You're
up.
not going to stump me on Georgia conservation.
No, I promise. So, but I grew up in Atlanta, and my sort of entree into the environment was basically as a kid, we had a little tiny forest patch. It was a very suburban part of Atlanta. And I grew up, I'm an only child, and sort of, exploring our little backyard. But it really wasn't until, then I moved to California when I was 15, finished high school in San Juan Capistrano, so just
Nice.
over in Orange County. And, but it wasn't really until I graduated from college, I went to Emory University back in Atlanta, that I kind of went on, became my path towards nature conservation. And I'll tell you just a quick overview of that background. My first job out of college, so I graduated with a dual degree in English and political science, and which is really not very marketable for anything except for law school, or basically that's it, work in a bookstore. But I had this passion for travel, and I'd always been fascinated with Japan. So I joined something called Japan Exchange in Teaching when I was 21, and I moved to a small village about an hour and a half from south of Tokyo. And it was my first entree into deep living outside the United States, and I would tell you that it was a humbling experience. Everything I had known being in the U.S. to be kind of ripped from that whole environment and put into a place that I didn't speak very much of the language, the religion, everything was different. And one of the things that was really different for me growing up in the suburbs of the East Coast was the relationship between farming and forest and community. In Japan, who in the room has been to Japan? Okay, so many of you have. So they have a concept in Japan called satayama, and that basically translates as a connection between the field and the forest. And as you walk around, I lived in a small rice farming village, and I would just see for the first time in my life, I was so used to farms being very far away, and being in that community and seeing the connections between farmers so close to the forest, and how every farmer would tell me about how important the preservation of the forest around the farm was for their own rice production on farm. So that was a bit of a aha moment. After Japan, I was there for a year, but my passion had been to move to Africa. So I saved my money in Japan, and I moved to Namibia. Who's been to Namibia?
Wow.
Okay, well, that's impressive. You guys, of course, have.
Before she goes on, Mom and Dad, were you worried about her traveling like this?
Oh, yes. In fact, my dad at one point, when I called him from rural Namibia and he heard lions in the background, he goes, "Oh, my God, we should have had a second one." Hedging strategy, Dad. So I went to the northern part of Namibia, and this was in 1993. So if you remember in 1993, a couple things. Namibia had gone through independence from South Africa in 1990, March of 1990. So at the time in Namibia, there was also an unbelievable drought. So this is post-apartheid Namibia. I was living in the far north on the border with Angola, about 9 miles south of the Angola border, in a place they called Owambo land. And Owambo land, where the Owambo people lived, one of the largest tribes in Namibia, is above the red line, which means the red line is a cattle line, which basically none of the cows from the north of the line could be transmitted or shipped to the south because of hoof and mouth disease. So we crossed this red line, which is this big deal, and it's north of Etosha, for those of you who know Namibia. And as we cross the red line, so I'm 22, almost 23, and I look out the window, and there are dead cows and goats everywhere, all along the road. And it's very, very dry, and you could tell people were really, really suffering. And I turned to the person who was bringing me there, and I said, I'm going to live here for 2 years? How am I going to do that? And I went on this journey. My job was to teach women English, and those women would go out into the villages and teach other women English. And the reason why that was important, because they had only learned Afrikaans. So Afrikaans was the language of South Africa, and it was really seen as an apartheid language. I went there thinking, I'm going to have this great experience, but I'm going to go back and I'm going to study public health. I thought I wanted to do public health. So I was posted at a hospital, at a Catholic German hospital, which is a whole other cultural experience for me, in addition to being in Namibia. And as I'm learning from the women, and I would spend my weekends going out to the farms with the women and learning about everything they had to do just to survive, the walks they had to take deep into the forest to get water, the firewood they had to collect and chop to create fires for food for their families. None of this was in my worldview at all. So it was a fascinating entree, and I thought that health would be where I would spend my time. So as I learned about the health challenges, if you remember in 1993, this is when HIV was rampant in Africa. It was also a huge stigma for the communities there. No one wanted to be, not only to get it, but also to die of it. So the nurses in the hospital where I was living would be paid to change the death certificate so it didn't say HIV. So the underreporting was massive. And the reason why HIV was spreading, it was the highest rates of HIV were in the community where I was living, was because there was no jobs for the men, because the farming was drying up because of climate change and other local factors. So the men would travel to the mines, the diamond mines in the south, and they would take new families, and then they would come back to their home village and spread HIV. So it was a huge, huge issue. The other thing that was rampant was malaria. And everyone had malaria. I got malaria. It was just sort of a thing that happened, and it would really decrease productivity because you're tired, and it's very, very challenging to live with, as well as cholera and TB. And all of those diseases were based on two real factors. One was a lack of economic opportunities, and two was environmental distress. And so I thought to myself, I had this one night when I was sitting with my dear friend Ria out on this beautiful full moon under the stars, and she said, Jen, it wasn't always like this. Like, we were a healthy, thriving community. We had beautiful trees, and we had water, and we could grow maize instead of millet, which is a more drought-resistant crop, which they were growing now. And I said, well, what happened? She said, we cut all our trees down. There was no one controlling that. We just did it, and we built bigger fences, and we recognize now that what we did was wrong, but we can't stop it. And I thought to myself, that for me is more of a systemic issue that I want to work on in helping people like Ria and her family than just focusing on the downstream public health issues, which were really a result of environmental and poverty factors. So I ripped up my public health degrees, my public health applications, and I decided to study economics and environment and I went to Columbia University for graduate school. And that started me sort of on this journey of this connection between health, environment, and economic development.
Where did you how did you move into the employment world out of this? It's travel and it's college and learning, but how do you take that into a career in conservation? We have some young students that are here I was talking to earlier. And they'll be interested. Hi, guys. What school are you from again? I'm from Palm Desert High School. Thank you. Palm Desert Charter Middle School. Thank you for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much
so
for being
with
here.
their age, and they might be looking up to you. So what do you do now? You have your Columbia degree.
Yes.
How did you enter the workforce?
Well, I'd like to say that it was very well planned, but there is some serendipity involved. So first when I was in graduate school, I took advantage of some internship opportunities, and I traveled to Zimbabwe, and that got me, I stayed there for a few months and learned a lot. I was interested in microfinance at the time. So I worked on a women's savings collective project there in Zimbabwe, outside of Bulawayo. And that sort of pushed me into microfinance realm. So I was super interested. I worked at a place called Women's World Banking right out of graduate school. And then the serendipity part was I went jogging with a friend in Central Park, and we were like sweaty, and she's like, oh, I forgot to give you this. And she hands me something called Monday Developments, which was a job board at the time. Now it's all electronic, but at the time it wasn't. And I saw a position for the best title of a job ever, which was the Wild Harvest Products Manager at Conservation International. And I was like, this sounds amazing. I'm going to apply for this. I'd never heard of Conservation International. I had no idea what it was, but they wanted somebody with international experience who spoke some Spanish, had time in Africa, and I was like, okay, I can do that. So I got the job, and I started, and my job at Conservation International was so cool. I got to go and travel with the Body Shop and a company called Aveda, which I'm sure many of you heard of, and help source botanicals, working with community groups all over the world. Because the idea, you might be wondering, well, why would a place called Conservation International want to be doing this work? And the reason is quite simple. And again, it blended my history in Namibia, my experience in Namibia, which was, if we don't help local people who live around areas that need to be protected to ensure that they have a livelihood that depends on the preservation rather than the extraction of nature, we're never going to achieve the environmental goals that any organization or any community has. So we have to make jobs that are sustainable for people, not only from an environmental perspective, but from a financial perspective. And so that job kind of then catapulted me at Conservation International. I stayed there for 23 years, moved from that to running because of my microfinance experience, I ran a small medium enterprise investment fund and worked with coffee farmers that were selling coffee to Starbucks in places like Mexico and Sumatra, Indonesia, and many, many other places around the world. And then I sort of moved up the chain. Conservation International is a very entrepreneurial place. It was quite small. It actually came out of the Nature Conservancy, which we'll get to. In 1987, it spun off to do only international work outside the U.S. And then I ultimately became the chief operating officer, using a little bit of my finance background and business background, and then ultimately president until I was poached.
So, well, good. And first, what animal or mammal in Africa did you experience poaching of?
Let's see. I have seen a lot of poaching in Africa. I've seen rhinos being slaughtered firsthand, meeting with the rangers. Last year I was in Kenya, and I saw some pretty devastating elephant work as well, which was not pretty.
And does that make you emotional when you have to experience something like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a whole other. The wildlife trafficking topic is a really intense one to discuss. But just briefly, the trafficking situation now, it's gotten better, I would say, with elephants, and the ivory ban has helped that a lot. But our position as TNC is that some responsible hunting can be done in certain places, although, of course, the photography safari angle is much better for local communities long term. So the poaching that I've seen in northern Kenya, for example, is really devastating. It's mostly coming over the border armed, and it's not just about the poaching, it's also about the inter-conflicts within communities, where some community members will be paid by the Somalis to go and actually kill elephants and rhinos and other species that are there. But the good news is, I'm an impatient optimist. The good news is that enforcement's getting better, and a lot of the enforcement's happening at the community level. So communities are getting involved and are getting the right incentives to ensure that this stops. But we often think in the West that elephants all have to be preserved, and they're important for the rest of the planet. The reality is, I was in Gabon last summer. Elephants are a huge challenge for communities. They raid crops. So you imagine you're a small farmer and you're growing these crops, and this elephant comes and takes your livelihood. So it's not so black and white that elephants are good and people are bad. It's much more complex than that. And so I would encourage all of you, if you do have the chance to go to Africa or go back to Africa, to really learn about the human's perspective around, the local community's perspective around wildlife. It is very, very intense. I had a friend who was working in South Africa, and she had a farmer say to her once, when you start caring about my cows, I'll start caring about your rhinos. And I think that's sort of the whole interesting perspective that we all in the West need to think about as we approach poaching.
We say that you were poached, and I won't go in between it, but when you got picked by the Nature Conservancy, and now you did learn business and economics, how much money does the Nature Conservancy fundraise a year? And does that fall on your shoulders?
Thankfully, not all of it falls on my shoulders, but as the CEO, a lot of it, of course, does. And we are the largest environmental NGO. We are just under 5,000 staff now in 70 countries. And last year we raised over $1 billion. And that was our second best fundraising year ever. Thank you. And part of it is the fact that I think people around the world are really thinking more about the connections between nature and climate change. And we had a great session earlier with Amanda Little talking about the future of food and how that preserving nature is so critical, not only for those of us that want to go enjoy and have wonderful walks here in Palm Springs, but also it's so interconnected to everything that humans need to survive and is increasingly under threat, of course, from climate change and other environmental stresses. So the more that we can work together to preserve it and invest in this, not just in the Nature Conservancy, but in all wonderful local organizations, the better we'll be off.
Just briefly, tell people, particularly if they're not familiar with the Nature Conservancy, I'm sure most people here are, but when was it founded and what is its mission?
Sure. So the Nature Conservancy is 72 years old. So 1951 we were founded, and we really started, interestingly, in New York State. It was a group of women in particular who came together and said, this particular area was going to be developed, and they went in and they said, we can't let this happen on our watch. We need to protect this land. And there's a long history and intertwisted story, but basically they were able to preserve about a 40-acre area called Mayanis Gorge, which was the first purchase of the Nature Conservancy in New York State. And that then exploded. So over the succeeding years, we were able to, our first strategy really was to buy land, and it was focused in the U.S., and we started, in fact, connecting to your wonderful book. Rachel Carson was a big supporter of the Nature Conservancy, and she was living not in Maine, but had a deep connection to Maine, and Maine was our 5th chapter that we created, and it's through the revenues from the Silent Spring, from her book, that are still continuing to this day. We get a royalty check every year from Rachel Carson's first book for the Maine chapter, which is an incredible, I think, story. And that she said, she has this quote about TNC, which I think you did put in your book, which is there's no other organization that's doing as much specifically to save nature than TNC, and I think that holds true today. We've changed a lot since 1951, as you can imagine. We still do a lot of work preserving the lands and waters on which all life depends, and that includes the most critical habitats here in the U.S., but also overseas. Of course, we started our international program in about 1980, and the focus there, unlike the U.S., you can't go and buy land in most places around the world, so you really have to work with indigenous groups, with local communities to ensure that land is preserved. And then in subsequent years, we started thinking, okay, the land aspect and the ocean aspects are very, very important, but if we don't address climate change, all these lands, all these assets around the world, which we've been protecting, will be undermined because of the freight train that really is changing our entire world. So that's when we decided to pivot, and we do a lot more in climate change science, working with companies to make sure that they're adhering to their targets or setting bigger targets, working with policy, so the Inflation Reduction Act and all the big U.S. policies that have come out have been a lot through TNC's approach, our groundwork in the states, both in red states and purple states and blue states, to ensure that people are focused on nature preservation.
Very good. And well, give us a kind. I know I could rattle up 100 incredible places I know the Nature Conservancy saved. But why don't we frame it this way? What have been a couple of recent campaigns that TNC has been part of that you feel that you came out victorious? The first one comes to mind is Bristol Bay, Alaska. What happened in Bristol Bay? What is it? Why was that an environmental flashpoint?
Yes, so Bristol Bay, in fact, just 2 days ago, there was a big announcement that the EPA is going to block the Pebble Mine. So the Pebble Mine, the Bristol Bay, Alaska, for those of you that don't know, it's an incredible, I haven't actually been there myself, but it's an incredible place, deep indigenous connection to that ocean, and it's 50% of the world's Pacific wild salmon is coming from that place. It's absolutely incredible. So in terms of an economic value to the local communities, and especially the indigenous communities that live off that area, it was critical, and it's been a big contentious debate in the U.S. government for a long time. TNC has a fantastic Alaska chapter that's working with the tribes, had been working with the tribes to make sure that that area was protected forever, not just for the importance of the salmon, but for, of course, the cultural heritage that is there. So the Pebble Mine right now has been stopped, and we're really excited about the results there. And of course, again, we try to stay a little bit behind the scenes and let our indigenous partners take the lead, because that's the way it should be, because it's their place. It's not ours. We're just there to enjoy it, and but they've been preserving it for a long time.
And what about in California? Wasn't there the the Dangerman Preserve?
Yes.
What is the Dangerman Preserve, and what role did TNC play?
Yeah, so the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve is a 24,000 acres of coastal habitat in Santa Barbara County. That's really basically the largest intact expanse of California that's left. That hasn't been either, well, that's non-military. And the Dangerman Preserve, so Jack and Laura, does anyone know who Jack Dangerman is? Yes, okay, so Jack Dangerman is an incredible guy who founded a company called Esri, which is a satellite company that does phenomenal work on satellite mapping. A lot of the COVID maps that you saw when COVID was first starting, and I remember being in his office in March of 2020, and he had this huge digital map of COVID and all over the world, and they were showing the intensity of COVID cases that were popping up. So that's the kind of mapping they do. So Jack proposed to his wife near a place called Point Concepcion, which is now in part of this whole area. And they just fell in love with this place. They fell in love there. They decided to spend their lives together at this place. And so he donated, I think it was $164 million for the Nature Conservancy to purchase the 24,000 acres of land that was threatened with development, coastal development. And so it's there. That was in 2017. And this place is absolutely phenomenal. It is a place of not only great beauty, but also a place of science experimentation. So it's a place where we can go and look at how different types of carnivores are using that area for crossing through. We can look at animals in an expanse of land in California where, again, it doesn't exist anywhere else. We can look at things like climate change, adaptation strategies. So it's a living laboratory for the preservation of nature, and it's just a wonderful example in California of things that we can do when we put our mind to it.
Is there one TNC property that you have a personal attachment to? I know I don't mean to single out one, but one that just for somebody that just jumps to mind.
Yes. So when I first got this job, thank you for the question. When I first got this job, it was COVID, right? So I couldn't fly. March 2020, and I live in a house, a small house in Washington D.C. And we have a she's now 15, but a daughter, and we were all kind of going crazy. I was like, can we get out of here? Like, let's rent an RV. And let's go travel and go see the Nature Conservancy's, some of the Nature Conservancy's properties around the United States. So we did. My husband was like, are you crazy? And we're not RV people. We live in a city. We have, barely have a car. But we did. We piled into the RV and we traveled around and visited 9 states. And that first summer, we did it again the second summer. We didn't do it last summer. But the second summer we did as well. And there are so many, Douglas, it's hard to pick just one.
Or pick a couple.
But okay, I'll pick a couple. One is, I'll mention one in the Appalachian Mountains. So it's not just places, it's also big scale areas, right? So Dangerman's a great example in California of one preserve that's intact. But one of the things we're trying to do more of, a way a little bit evolving from our history, is how do we create these bigger areas that are more meaningful for intact ecology, and of course for the preservation of, helping to mitigate some of the climate change impacts. So Appalachian Mountains. So I'll give you an example in West Virginia. We have a couple properties around in the Canaan Valley that we've purchased. But what I love about our work in the Appalachians is it's trying to go to scale. It's trying to look at, from a systems approach, how do we connect areas in the 13 states that cover the Appalachian Mountains? So we really have a contiguous ecological corridor for wildlife, for birds, and for natural climate adaptation. And so we created a project in the Central Appalachians called the Cumberland Forest. And this was an area of 253,000 acres of land that we helped through things like carbon credits. So basically having forest owners to be paid a revenue stream in order to preserve the forest. So it's an actual, instead of the revenue coming from extraction, they're getting revenue from preservation. So we have a whole strategy there that's actually creating a much, much larger construct of ecology than what we'd have if we just bought individual properties. So that would be one. Another one I'll pick is an ocean one. And that is, I was very fortunate to go to the island of Palmyra, which is not really an island, it's more of an atoll. And it's 1,000 miles south of Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we co-own it, or co-manage it, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And is absolutely a stunning, stunning place that is where you can actually, I remember the first time I went snorkeling there, and I came up after seeing the most, and I've been diving all over the world, seeing the most preserved, most beautiful coral I've ever seen in my life, and manta rays and sharks, so many sharks, very friendly sharks, unless they're pregnant and they're not friendly. But
Dad, she's moved up to sharks.
Right,
now.
exactly. I went from lions to sharks. So, but that I remember just crossing the water's edge and going, this is what it's supposed to be like. This is what nature looks like when it's protected and undisturbed. No dynamite fishing, no overdue, no fishing for 18 million hectares around this area. It's completely preserved and has been for a very, very long time. No fishing. You have to freeze your clothes before you go so you don't take any biocontaminants into the island. It's very well preserved. That is especially, wow. In fact, Sylvia Earle, the great oceanographer, many of you may have heard of, she calls Palmyra one of the hope spots. One of those 10 or so places around the world that are still pristine. So that would be my ocean example.
Wonderful example. You guys do a program at TNC that I find really interesting, which is Debt for Nature Swap. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Debt for Nature Swap.
Exactly, yes.
It's self-explanatory, but in some ways debt, that you have a debt and you can swap it. Explain what that program is.
Yeah, so this is a really exciting initiative that we're working on with many countries around the world. So I often talk about the twin crises of biodiversity and climate. There's a third crisis, there's many other crises, but the third one that is really hitting a lot of developing countries is the debt crisis. So 60% of developing countries are either at risk or soon to be at risk of defaulting on their debt. Now, there are also, at the same time, places like the Bahamas and Barbados and Seychelles islands, but also countries like Gabon and many others that are sort of lower to middle income countries. They are now feeling the impacts of climate change and are having to build seawalls. They're having to address the fact that their farmers can't grow the same food that they were before because of water stress and increasing soil degradation. So they need to invest in the future of tomorrow, but they have these very, very, very high debt payments. In fact, the level of indebtedness has doubled since 2015 of most countries in the developing world. So what does that mean? That means that there's an opportunity as well to use some creative, and this is what I love about TNC and really why I joined from CI, was the ability to really think creatively about what can we do to help those countries to actually transition some of their debt to conservation. So it's this initiative called the Debt for Nature Swaps, or Debt for Planet, we're calling it. This whole initiative started in the Seychelles back in 2008, and the idea was quite simple. The Seychelles government said, we want to protect our oceans, but we have all this debt. Can you help us? So we got together with a group of private investors, and we decided to do what's called a swap. So we basically changed the repayment plans and bought back their old debt and refinanced it with new debt that had a different payment scheme with lower interest payments and a longer term to repay. The savings they were then able to put into a trust fund that then pays for the conservation of their oceans. It's an ocean habitat the size of Germany. It's huge, huge impact. So it took us a while to do the next deal. These are complicated transactions, but we found a partner in Credit Suisse and in the Development Finance Corporation, which is the former OPIC, not OPEC, but OPIC, which is a U.S. government facility which underwrites risk and underwrites some debt. So we were able to partner with them, and just last year at the Glasgow Climate Conference, actually, we announced the second swap, which was in Belize, which basically took $537 million of Belize's sovereign debt and refinanced it into $30 million of money for conservation. So the Belize government loved this so much, the Prime Minister's talking to everybody about this. And now we just finished one in Barbados. So I was with the Prime Minister of Barbados a few months ago in Sharm el-Sheikh, and her name is Mia Mottley. And if you don't know who Mia Mottley is, she is a powerhouse. She is an amazing spokesperson for small island states that are being massively impacted by climate change. And she's also a spokesperson for a reform in our financial institutions, the way the World Bank finances, the way the IMF finance, to be thinking about how do you finance countries who are under threat from climate change in a very, very different way. So check out Mia Mottley. But we did this deal in Barbados that, again, created the opportunity for massive amounts of funding for conservation while using private money. And this is the genius of this. Not $1 philanthropy was needed for these transactions. And we've got now a pipeline of $10 billion in debt we want to refinance, which will yield $2 billion for money for conservation, all funded by the private sector, not by philanthropy. So that's
Well,
great.
that's such a large and incredible program. And let me bring it down to something very small. Let's say somebody here in Rancho Mirage or Palm Desert knows a beautiful, or owns, or a rancher, somebody owns a beautiful parcel of wild California. Could they ever reach out to the Nature Conservancy and say, we'd like our landscape to be considered a holding of the Nature Conservancy? And if so, I mean, how do you decide what land that you guys can be conservators of and which property doesn't meet your criteria?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is, of course, you can reach out. The next answer would be, we probably wouldn't take it unless it was a very large area that had really, really, really important species. And this is part of our evolution as an organization. In the early days, we were doing a lot of that. We would help, 20 acres here, 50 acres there. We buy it. But the reality is, it's extremely expensive. And as a nature conservation organization that has global ambition, we have to be very smart about the lands that we will take on. Now, often what we transitioned into is more conservation easements. And those are easy to manage, and those are something that we often help individual owners with addressing. But there are certainly areas like in Wyoming and Colorado, big ranches, big scale areas that we can help with restoration efforts, et cetera. But it needs to have high biological diversity and be an area that's probably immediately under threat. And that is where we might come in. Or, I would encourage, if anyone's thinking of that, the U.S. has lots of local land trusts. Working with your local land trust is a great way to do exactly that. They can help either take it off your hands or develop a conservation easement for that property.
Now, if you're one of the young people here in high school and you wanted to get engaged with the Nature Conservancy, what could they do to be engaged in a way that would be both educational but also fulfilling?
Absolutely. Well, I would encourage you all to become members of the Nature Conservancy, of course, but also to volunteer. So there's so many opportunities to get out and volunteer, either on a preserve here in California. We have, we'll do cleanups, we'll do, road construction and trail clearing and all sorts of things. And that's just a great way. I've met so many young people who started out volunteering or interning with TNC and now are permanent staff, and we really encourage that. So absolutely, there's lots of opportunities, not just with TNC, but your local environmental organizations, because this is going to do what we need to do on this planet to really make it a better place. We've all got to pitch in, and where we can, if you have the opportunity to volunteer with your time, or obviously investing in local organizations, please do, because it's going to take all of us.
Now, from saying get involved with the local land trust to projects you're doing, enduring earth projects with something as large as Pew.
Yeah.
How do you collaborate? There used to be a guy named Ding Darling who was in the Great Depression. They created the duck stamp and started saving habitat and bird reservations. But his concern over conservation, it was that there are all these groups.
Yeah.
But they're all working their own agendas. And if there was like more of a giant one fist, but what's happening is groups like the Nature Conservancy are partnering with other powerhouses now in a very dramatic way. What's going on with Enduring Earth?
Yeah, so thanks so much for asking that. So, I've been in this business now for about 25 years, and I have to say, I don't think any other sector competes like the environmental sector. It is very intense competition between the different organizations. And I had a foundation leader tell me once, when I became president of CI, he said, it would be so great if I didn't talk to the CEO of WWF on Monday, and the CEO of the Nature Conservancy on Tuesday, and the CEO of WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, on Wednesday, and they all are asking me for exactly the same thing, right? Money for the same place. Why don't you guys get together, work together? And that's what we're doing now. I'm happy to say, things have changed a lot. I think part of it is the urgency, part of it is a different style of leadership, and now with the Enduring Earth Partnership specifically that you mentioned, Douglas, it's a collaboration between TNC, the World Wildlife Fund, and Pew Charitable Trust, that many of you maybe don't know, but they have a huge nature portfolio, and a group called Zoma Labs, which is the private office of Ben Walton, one of the Walton family members. And this collaboration has a goal to protect 500 million acres of land around the world by 2030. And this is through a mechanism called Project Finance for Permanence, which is basically using the model of venture capital and having a single close for conservation. So the countries around the world that have raised their hand and said, we want to preserve 30% of our land by 2030, which is this big environmental movement that's happening now called 30 by 30. But yet we don't have the financial resources to do it. We will come in, help them with landscape planning, commitments to conservation, reduction of harmful fishing or deforestation and other environmental stressors, and then we will help set up the financial mechanisms to do that. But I will tell you what's so radical about this is that unlike the days of old when we all had our donors and we all protected our donors, I'm raising money for WWF. They're raising money for our teams. We all have leads of each, like Namibia is being led by WWF. I'm raising money for Namibia. I don't care that it's not TNC. The point is we have a common vision, and then we're all coming in together and saying, that's our North Star. Doesn't matter who gets the credit, but we all have to be in it, and we all have to put our logos and our egos at the door. That is different. That is really, really different. And I think it shows you a commitment to something bigger than our institutions, which is really magical.
Have you thought, or maybe there is a mechanism, a kind of summit where the leaders of the big groups, let's call it the Big 20, just for the sake of it, meet once a year to strategize together and burden share and think about how we can be more effective as a cohesive unit than 20 individual parts?
It's a great idea. I don't think there is one like that.
Now it is. It's born today.
Now you heard it here first.
And she gets the credit.
And this is the beauty of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, right? This kind of collaboration. No, we do. I would say at regional levels, like the Amazon Basin, in a specific region, there's some pretty good collaboration. A lot of the collaboration is being pushed by the donors. Like the Bezos Earth Fund, who's is a major partner of TNC's. We were in Gabon last year, actually with Jeff Bezos and his partner Lauren Sanchez, and we sat at a table with all the different organizations working in the Congo Basin, and we talked about what we're doing, how we're collaborating, how we're ensuring that we can, work in a better way together. So it's happening, but I like that idea. We should do that.
Well, on our remaining time, I wanted to ask you a personal question about, why I've noticed as a historian of the environmental movement that women have been such progenitors in it. I mean, at grassroots levels early on, I mean, Joshua Tree National Monument here was, women in Pasadena getting together and talking about, can we do something to save the Joshua trees? But it's just endless. What is it about women that have brought them to the forefront of the natural, of local and national conservation efforts for so long, even at eras when, the sexism and misogyny wasn't allowing women into Congress, into the Senate, but they were still leading the conservation crusades of their time?
Yeah, no one's ever asked me that question before. My flippant answer would be like, we're going into the woods to get away from the men. But that's not actually the case. I think, women are amazing grassroots organizers. You look throughout history and you see it everywhere, from the civil rights movement to the environmental movement. I think it was always there. I think we just are now recognizing the role. And even just this week, I didn't know how important 2 women in particular were for the birth of TNC. I just learned this 2 days ago.
Catherine Ordway was
Catherine Ordway, exactly. Catherine Ordway.
She would save parts of early 1950s, early 50s. She started saving Minnesota prairie and places when people weren't thinking that prairie lands were saving. She was on the forefront of it all.
And she gave the Nature Conservancy $62 million over her life, which she was our first principal gift donor. That was a woman. I think no one knew that before. It was sort of unearthed by you and others. And so that sort of history, I think, is just becoming more, we're paying attention to it more. That being said, I will say there's still not enough women leaders of organizations. I'm the first permanent female leader of the Nature Conservancy. There's WWF now, WWF World Wildlife Fund International now has their first. They've been around for like 120 years. Finally, we are over half the population. Finally, there's a woman leader of WWF. So that's great. It's slowly happening, but we still have a long way to go in terms of leadership.
Is there one of the geniuses of TNC is that their ability to talk to both Democrats and Republicans in an America that's in this, we all grip lock of something or other. How do you handle that? Because you have views that you might really prefer. Let's just say you might really have a lot of what the Biden administration is doing. You might personally feel like these are great. They're dealing with climate, but then you're dealing some Republicans on the right that aren't. But yet TNC seems to navigate both worlds when most of us can't. How do you do that?
Yeah, I think it's partially who we have at the local level. So we're and I said this in the last session, but Republican Senator Bill Frist is the chair of our board from Tennessee, and we try to make sure that we have bipartisan people on our boards. The other thing is that our language is different in many ways. We recognize the critical role that nature plays for everyone. It's not a left issue. This is a person issue, no matter what political spectrum you come from. And it's also what we talk about. We talk about the role of economic development, of jobs, that farmers are the heroes. They're not the villains. We need to help farming communities and make sure that they have the tools to make sure that water is preserved on their lands. So it's really the framing of the conversation that I think in a way enables us to, it's not always easy. With Bristol Bay, we were working with mining companies and they were fighting us tooth and nail. So being bipartisan doesn't mean that you're always agreeing. It just means that you have to figure out where the leverage points are to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And I think that's something that we've done quite well.
Well, I'm going to end our session with one last question, and it's actually one for all of you to ponder. Since we're at a book festival, Henry David Thoreau famously wrote Walden and fell in love with that pond and watched. Are they still teaching Walden in school, guys?
Yes.
They are?
Yes.
Have you read it?
Yes. We read excerpts from it from last year in my AP language and literature.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Oh, good. And you guys back there, folks, have you guys read Walden? Has anybody here read Walden recently? Well, it's the great book that started, some people think, environmentalism. I'm glad you read some of but I'm asking this question because there was a Walden Woods Preservation Project, including Don Henley of the band The Eagles and others saving to protect not just the literary shrine of Walden Pond, but the woods around it as an ecosystem. What is your Walden Pond? And I'll ask each of you that. What one place in the natural world that you've experienced, it could be your grandmother's farm, it could be right here on a hilltop overlooking Palm Springs, it could be the ocean in La Jolla with the seals barking, and it could be anything. But what's one place in your life that had a spiritual, that you connected to the landscape in a way that was almost religious or spiritual, and it created has become a deep part of your soul?
Wow. Well, the place that I think about a lot is Silver Creek, Idaho. So that is a place near Sun Valley, Idaho, that the Nature Conservancy has, owns the land and has been preserving it. And it is some of the hardest fly fishing on the planet. So there's a challenge there as well. But it's also just this absolutely stunning place with incredible waters that I can just, whenever I'm having a stressful day, I just imagine like sinking in my waders in the water and just hearing the sounds of the water and the birds, and there's moose and elk and everything around, and it's a pretty magical place.
Beautiful answer. Since there's not, we're going to have to wrap here, but does anybody want to offer their Walden real quick? Anybody have one place?
Columbia River Gorge, that's a good one.
Let me hear a couple more, and then we'll go.
When I'm pulling my beans, he would hoe his beans in the morning, and
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah. So I
That's
have
great.
a garden,
Oh, you have a garden, so
a vegetable garden, and I do work in my beans, and I think of that statement.
and where's your vegetable garden at?
On the other side of San Jacinto.
Very good. Beautiful answer. Great.
He's got one.
For me, I'm a volunteer at the Living Desert Garden.
Oh, great.
Yay.
We love the Living Desert.
I like to call it our desert paradise, and I specialize mostly in the Desert Plant Conservation Center.
Fantastic.
I can find like so many of like our Walden ponds there, and like even with the connections across like the world, like in Africa with like black mambas protecting brown oceans.
Yes.
Oh,
The zoo speaks a language that like you have to like truly like see and it just provides such like serenity.
Wow.
what a
amazing.
beautiful answer.
That is. Thank
I think we better end
you.
with that because we're not going to
Yeah.
get